On the morning of September the 8th, 1900, the man who ran the weather office in Galveston, Texas, saddled his horse and rode down to the beach to watch the water. His name was Isaac Klein. Within a single day, the sea he was watching would kill at least 6,000 of his neighbors, and by some counts as many as 12,000, and it would leave the richest city in Texas lying broken on a sandbar that stood barely 8 feet above the waves. This is not, in the end, a story about the storm. The storm is only the beginning. This is the story of what the survivors did after the water went back out and the dead had been counted, when the people who were left standing looked at the flat, low island that had just drowned their families and made a decision that still sounds impossible when you say it plainly. They decided they would lift the entire city up off the ground, by hand, one building at a time, and set it back down again higher than the sea could ever reach. Keep that picture in your mind, because we are going to earn it slowly, the way they did. Begin with a warning that never came, because it explains why so many died. In the last days of August that year, a dangerous storm was already crossing the Caribbean, and some of the finest hurricane forecasters in the world had their eyes on it. They were in Cuba, at an observatory in Havana run by Jesuit priests, a place called the Belen Observatory, which at that time was among the most advanced weather stations anywhere on Earth. The Cuban forecasters read the sky correctly. They believed a great storm was building and turning toward the Gulf, but their warnings were not allowed to reach the people who needed them. The chief of the United States Weather Bureau in Washington was a man named Willis Moore, and in the bitter aftermath of the war with Spain, Moore did not trust the Cuban forecasters and did not want the American public listening to them. He ordered reports from the Cuban meteorologists blocked from the telegraph lines. He cut the direct line between the Weather Bureau office in Havana and the office in New Orleans, so that Havana had to report only to Washington, and Washington alone would decide what the Gulf Coast was told. The Cubans were even discouraged from using the very word hurricane for fear of causing panic. So the most accurate warning in the world was smothered by pride, and the storm came on toward Texas in something close to silence. To understand the scale of what was lost, you have to understand what Galveston was in the year 1900. It was not a sleepy town. It was the largest city in Texas, and one of the busiest ports in the whole country, the place through which the cotton of the American South poured out to the world. Men called it the Wall Street of the South. It had electric streetcars, an opera house, telephones, and gaslit mansions, and more millionaires for its size than almost anywhere in the nation. And all of it, every wharf and every ballroom, was built on a low-barrier island of sand. The highest natural ground in the entire city stood less than 9 feet above the level of the sea. Most of the streets lay lower still. There was no seawall. There had never been one, because no one believed one was needed. Isaac Klein had said as much in print. A few years before, he had written that the notion of a hurricane doing serious harm to Galveston was, in his own word, absurd. He argued that the long, shallow slope of the sea floor off the Texas coast would drag the power out of any great storm and break it apart before it reached the beach. He was a careful and respected man, and on the single most important question of his life, he was completely wrong, and he would carry that error to his grave. On that Saturday, the swells rolled in long and heavy under an odd, brassy sky, and the water began to climb into the streets while the wind was still only strong, not yet murderous. Klein rode his horse up and down the beachfront, telling families to move back from the water, though on that flat island, there was nowhere truly high to send them. Then the storm itself arrived, and the wind rose past anything the instruments could record. It is believed the gusts passed 120 miles an hour before the gauges were torn from the roof of the weather office. The barometer fell to among the lowest readings ever seen in the country, and the wind drove the sea across the island in a single rising wall of water until the Gulf on one side and the bay on the other met in the middle of the city, and Galveston simply disappeared beneath the sea. The storm surge rose more than 15 feet over an island whose highest point stood under 9. Whole rows of houses were lifted off their foundations and shoved inland, and as they went, they collapsed into a churning mass of broken lumber that rolled across the city like a grindstone, and almost everyone caught in the open water was crushed inside it. Isaac Klein's own home was large and strongly built, and dozens of neighbors had crowded into it believing it would hold. In the black of the night, it broke apart. His wife Cora, who was carrying their 4th child, was drowned in the wreck. His brother Joseph dragged Isaac and his 3 daughters out of the ruin, and the 5 of them clung to a floating section of wall and rode it through the storm, turning their own backs to the wind so their bodies would shield the children from the flying timber. they lived. Down the beach, a different group did not, and their story is the one that has never left this island. At the far western edge of town stood St. Mary's Orphans Asylum, run by an order of nuns called the Sisters of Charity, and inside it that night were 10 sisters and about 90 children. As the water rose into the dormitories, the sisters did the only thing they could think of. They cut down the long clothesline from the yard, and each sister tied a length of it around her own waist, and then bound 6, 7, 8 children to herself, so that whatever came, the little ones would not be swept away alone. When the buildings finally gave way, the ropes that were meant to save them held them together in death. 10 sisters and every child but 3 were lost. Only 3 boys came through that night alive, and their names were remembered ever after. William Murney, Frank Madera, and Albert Campbell, found the next day clinging to a floating tree. If you remember nothing else about the storm, remember the nuns and their clothesline, because that is the human weight this whole story rests upon. When the sun rose on Sunday, the survivors walked out into a city that no longer existed. Where there had been streets, there were now long ridges of shattered wood packed solid with the dead. No one has ever counted them exactly, and that uncertainty matters, so let us be honest about the number. The most careful estimates place the dead between 6,000 and 12,000 people. The figure most often repeated is around 8,000. Whatever the true count, it remains, to this day, more than a century later, the deadliest natural disaster in the history of the United States. Nothing before or since has killed so many Americans in a single blow. The bodies were so many that ordinary burial was impossible. They were first carried out to sea and dropped, and when the tide brought them back to the beaches, the living were forced to burn them on great funeral pyres that smoked over the ruined city for weeks. For a full day, the rest of the country did not even know. The storm had torn down every telegraph wire and every bridge to the mainland, and the island lay cut off and silent in the Gulf, while the nation went about its business unaware. A small party of survivors finally crossed the bay by boat, found a working telegraph on the mainland, and sent out a message that was almost too large to be believed. Only then, more than a day after the water fell, did help begin to move toward Galveston from the outside world. In the days that followed, order itself broke down. Looting spread through the wreckage, and by the middle of that week, the authorities declared martial law and called in the Texas militia to patrol the ruins with rifles. Into that chaos came help from the outside, and at the head of it came a woman nearly 80 years old. Clara Barton, the founder of the American Red Cross, traveled to Galveston in person, with supplies and money and workers, and directed the relief herself. It would prove to be the last field mission of her long life. Her people helped raise a new orphanage for the children the storm had left with no one, and helped bring in the lumber with which a broken city could at least begin. But before the city could begin anything, it had to be dug out. Under those long ridges of splintered lumber lay the dead and the ruin of nearly everything the island had owned, and all of it had to be cleared away by hand before a single new foundation could be laid. That grim labor, the sorting of the wreckage and the recovery of the lost, went on for months, and it fell largely to the same exhausted survivors who had just buried their own families. This is the point at which most towns simply end, and there were serious, respectable voices in those weeks who argued that the only sane course was to abandon Galveston altogether, to move the port and whatever people remained to the safe mainland and leave the sandbar to the sea that had proven it could take the island whenever it pleased. The logic was hard to answer. The place had shown exactly what it was, and everyone knew it would flood again. The people of Galveston chose to stay and fight the Gulf instead. And the first thing they understood was that they could not fight it with the government they had. So, before a single wall was raised, they did something quietly radical. A group of the island's leading businessmen, calling themselves the Deep Water Committee, concluded that the old mayor and council could never organize a recovery on the scale required, and they pushed through an entirely new form of city government, a small board of appointed commissioners, each one made directly responsible for a single department of the rebuilding. It was called the Galveston Plan, and it worked so plainly that hundreds of cities across the United States would copy it in the years to come. Out of the worst disaster in American history, the survivors invented a new way to run an American city. But that was only the organizing. The real work was physical, and it was almost beyond belief. To design it, the county brought in 3 engineers and handed them the survival of the island. The first was a retired brigadier general named Henry Martin Robert. You may not know the storm, but you have almost certainly lived under his other work, because Henry Martin Robert is the man who wrote Robert's Rules of Order, the small book of parliamentary procedure that still governs how meetings are conducted in boardrooms and town halls across the country. The man who had spent his life bringing order to unruly rooms was now asked to bring order to the Gulf of Mexico itself. Beside him stood Alfred Noble, one of the most respected civil engineers in America, and a local engineer named H.C. Ripley who knew every foot of the island. In January of 1902, the three of them delivered their report, and it called for two enormous works that had to be done together. If you value the memory of ordinary people who did impossible work and were never thanked for it, subscribe to Global Old History, because that is the whole reason this channel exists. The first work was a seawall, and its design was cleverer than a plain barrier. A flat wall takes the full punch of a wave head-on and, over the years, loses. The wall the three engineers drew was curved, a concave face of solid concrete that leaned back toward the land, so that a charging wave would be caught by the curve, turned upward, and thrown back on itself out toward the sea. It stood 17 feet above the level of low tide. It was 16 feet thick at its base, and tapered as it rose. In front of it, on the beach side, they laid a wide apron of heavy granite boulders, called riprap, to break the sea before it even touched the concrete, and to keep the water from scooping the foundation out from beneath the wall. And the wall did not merely rest on the sand. Its builders drove deep rows of round timber, piling and interlocking sheet piling far down into the island beneath it, so that the sea could never undermine the foundation and pull the whole thing over, the way the water had pulled apart everything else in 1900. The first section ran more than 3 miles along the Gulf. Work began in the autumn of 1902, and the first stretch was finished in the summer of 1904. When it was done, Galveston had a long gray cliff of concrete standing between its streets and the sea that had killed its people. None of it was cheap, and none of it was certain. The county pledged its own credit to pay for the seawall, borrowing against the future of a city that a good many outsiders had already written off for dead. And there were respected engineers elsewhere in the country who said plainly that the second half of the plan was folly, that you could not lift an inhabited city off its own foundations without wrecking it, that it had never been done and could not be done. Galveston listened, and then went ahead and did it anyway. But here is the insight that turns this story from merely hard into almost unbelievable, the thing the three engineers understood that a lesser plan would have missed. A wall on the beach is useless if the land behind it still lies only a few feet above the sea. Water would simply flow around the ends of the wall or seep up through the low ground behind it, and the city would drown from the back while its fine new wall stood uselessly out front. For the wall to mean anything at all, the land itself had to be lifted. The entire city had to be raised, and not raised flat, but tilted, standing highest against the new seawall at the full 17 feet and sloping gently down toward the bay on the far side, so that from that day on, water would always run away from the people instead of gathering around them. The raising would give the city a second gift as well, one it had never truly had. The old flat island had no way to drain itself, no fall for its rainwater or its sewage, which was part of why sickness had always haunted the place in the hot months. By lifting the land and tilting it toward the bay, the engineers were, for the first time, building real drainage and sanitation into Galveston, a healthier city folded into the very same work that was meant to save it from the sea. Say that plainly, because it deserves to be said plainly. They were going to raise the ground beneath an entire living city. Not a building, not a block. Some 500 city blocks, every street and house and church and shop, every water main and gas pipe and streetcar rail across the developed half of the island, all of it lifted and packed underneath with new earth, while the people went on living and working there the whole time. Nothing on that scale had ever been attempted, and the tool that did the actual lifting, at the level where muscle met iron, was a screw turned by a human hand. The method was patient and exact, and it is worth walking through, because the people who watch this channel are the sort who want to know how a thing was really done. The engineers divided the developed city into sections, each about 1/4 of a mile square. Around each section, they raised an earthen dike to hold back what was coming. Then, inside that walled square, every single structure had to be jacked up off its foundation and held in the air while new ground was built beneath it. They did the lifting with jack screws. A jack screw is a simple device, a threaded iron post that raises a heavy load a small fraction of an inch with each turn of its handle, driven by nothing but a human arm. Beneath an ordinary house, the crews would set dozens of them. Beneath a large building, they set hundreds. And then, on a called signal, the men would move together from screw to screw, giving each one the same quarter turn, so that the whole structure rose evenly and stayed level, a sliver of an inch at a time, and did not tear itself apart. About 2,146 buildings in Galveston were lifted in exactly this way, turn by patient, turn by hand. Now think about what that meant for the families who owned those buildings, because this is the detail that makes the whole thing real. You did not move out. You lived in your house while it climbed slowly into the sky on its forest of iron screws. People kept house on top of jack screws, climbing a ladder to reach a front door that now hung 4 or 5 feet above the yard. Shops stayed open for business. Wooden catwalks were laid across the raw, wet fill so customers could reach the stores without wading through the sand slurry. For months at a stretch, entire neighborhoods went about their ordinary lives, suspended in the air above their own rising ground, breathing the smell of the dredged sea bottom, walking the planks in the mud, and refusing, the whole time, to leave. The most famous single lift in the entire project was a church. St. Patrick's Church was a massive brick building weighing some 3,000 tons, and the crews raised it a full 5 feet into the air on 700 jack screws turned by hand. And here is the detail that tells you everything about the people of that island. They did not close the church while they lifted it. Mass was celebrated every Sunday, right on schedule, while the entire sanctuary rose slowly toward heaven beneath the feet of the kneeling congregation. Picture it. 3,000 tons of brick, full of worshippers, climbing into the air on hand-cranked iron, and the service going on as though nothing at all were out of the ordinary. Once the buildings in a section hung in the air on their screws, the fill could come in, and this was the other half of the machine. The material was sand, and the sand came from the bottom of the sea. In all, the project would swallow more than 16 million cubic yards of it, spread across those 500 blocks, anywhere from a few inches thick at the bayside to as much as 11 feet deep against the seawall. Out in the harbor, dredges tore the sand up from the floor of the ship channel. To carry it into the heart of the residential district, the engineers cut a canal straight through the living city, 20 feet deep and 200 feet wide, running 2.5 miles inland. 4 great self-loading hopper dredges worked that canal, sucking up sand and water together and pumping the slurry through pipes into the diked sections, where it settled and drained and left new, higher ground behind when the water ran off. The slurry flowed under the lifted houses and around the standing screws and slowly buried the old low grade beneath a clean new layer, and everything was raised together, not only the buildings. The crews lifted the streetcar tracks and the water mains, the gas lines and the sewers, the fire hydrants standing in the streets, and where families cared enough to save them, the very trees and gardens were dug up, held aside, and replanted on the new grade. A city is not only its houses, it is a whole buried body of pipe and rail and wire, and every strand of it had to rise with the rest, or the raised city on top would have had no water to drink and no way to move. If you have ever done hard physical labor and felt, at the end of one long day, that you had reached the very edge of what a body can give, then hold that feeling up against this. It went on for 8 years, from 1903 to 1911, section by diked section, quarter mile by quarter mile. The people of Galveston lifted their city up out of the reach of the sea with iron screws and dredged sand and the strength of their own backs, and they did it while knowing they were racing the next hurricane, which might arrive any season and find the work only half finished. The men who turned those screws are almost entirely nameless to us today. We remember the 3 engineers, and we should, but the true labor, the endless turning of handles under the dead weight of a house, the digging of the dikes, the running of the dredges, the hauling of the fill, was done by thousands of workers whose names appear in no book at all. They were the ones standing in the wet sand while the slurry climbed their boots. They were the ones who kept 3,000 tons of church level to within a fraction of an inch. This channel exists for those men in particular, and if that is why you are here, then you already understand what this island did. And they did not stop at the wall and the raised grade. To complete the defense, they reached out and tied the vulnerable island to the safety of the mainland. Between 1909 and 1912, they built the Galveston Causeway, a long, solid, all-weather crossing carrying both the railroads and the new automobiles over the bay, so the island could no longer be completely cut off and stranded when the water rose. Its great rolling lift drawbridge was, when it was finished, the largest of its kind in the world. Piece by piece, wall and grade and causeway, the survivors turned a defenseless sandbar into a fortress against the Gulf. And then the sea came back to test it. In August of 1915, a hurricane struck Galveston that was, by many honest measures, as powerful as the storm that had destroyed the city 15 years before. The same island, the same Gulf, the same kind of monster. But this time, the island was not the same. This time there was a curved concrete wall 17 feet high standing against the water, and behind it a whole city that had lifted itself out of the flood. The surge came in and struck the seawall and was turned back and thrown down, exactly as the three engineers had drawn it. The wall held. The raised grade shed the water away toward the bay. Where the storm of 1900 had killed many thousands, the storm of 1915, a storm of nearly equal fury, killed only a small fraction of that number. The distance between those two death tolls is the exact measure of what all that hand labor had bought. It is the difference between a city that fights and a city that is merely lucky. And yet the fight did not restore everything the storm had taken. Galveston had been the great port of Texas, but after 1900, no one wanted to stake the future of a shipping empire on a sandbar lying in the path of the Gulf. Investors and planners turned their eyes inland, to a bayou town some 50 miles up the coast, and poured their money into digging a deep channel that would let ocean ships reach it in safety. That town was Houston. Its ship channel opened in 1914, and within a few years Houston had passed Galveston to become the leading port in Texas, and in time one of the busiest in the world. The storm did not only kill thousands of people, it quietly shifted the center of gravity of an entire state, and Galveston never ruled the coast again. There was another lesson written in the storm, and it lay in those silenced warnings from Cuba. The decision in Washington to control and suppress the forecasts from the Belen Observatory had helped fill the funeral pyres. In the years that followed, the way America watched the tropics and warned its own coasts slowly began to change, because 8,000 graves had shown, beyond argument, what happens when a warning is buried for the sake of pride. There is a temptation, telling a story like this one, to let it end in triumph and forget the graves it stands on. Do not let it. The seawall and the raised city are not a victory over the storm of 1900. Nothing could ever undo that. They are a promise made to the dead, a promise that what happened to them would not be allowed to happen the same way again. And the only material the living had with which to make that promise real was their own labor, turned into concrete and dredged sand and 17 hard-won vertical feet of ground. As for Isaac Klein, the forecaster who once called the danger absurd, the storm did not destroy him, though it took his wife and his certainty both. In 1901, he moved with the Weather Office to New Orleans, and there he spent 34 years as the leading forecaster of the Gulf Coast and became one of the foremost authorities on tropical storms in the country. The man who got it so terribly wrong in Galveston spent the rest of his long life trying to make certain the next city would get its warning in time. He never forgot the water, or Cora, or the morning he rode along the beach believing the sea would spare its own. And here is the part that matters most, the part that turns a story into something you can go and touch. It is still there. You can stand on it. The Galveston seawall still runs along the Gulf, extended over the years since to about 10 miles in length, one of the longest continuous sidewalks in the country. And on any evening you like, people walk it and drive along it and lean on its rail to watch the very sea that once came over the top of the island. The city behind it still rests on the ground those crews raised, still sloping quietly down toward the bay, exactly as three engineers drew it in 1902. The form of government they invented in their grief spread to hundreds of American cities. And the wall has stood against storm after storm in the century since, and it is standing yet. And most of the people it shelters have never once heard the names of the workers who turned the screws that lifted their streets up out of the sea. You can read the raising in the houses, too, if you know to look. Walk the old streets today, and you will see the grand homes of the historic district, standing with their first floors lifted high above the sidewalk. Long flights of front steps climbing to porches that the sand raised into the air more than a century ago, and the engineers of a later age did not forget what was done here. The seawall and the grade raising together were named a national landmark of American civil engineering, honored among the greatest works this country has ever built, nearly all of them accomplished with machines, and this one, at the level that truly mattered, accomplished by hand. Now you have heard them. The next time you see that long gray curve of concrete along the water, or hear that Galveston is still there after everything the Gulf has thrown at it, do not call it luck. It stands because after the worst day in the history of this country, a city refused to lose and raised itself up out of the sea by hand. If that is the kind of true story you want to keep hearing, about the ordinary people who built this nation with their hands and were never thanked, then subscribe to Global Old History, and we will keep going to stand where they stood, one forgotten place at a time.